I had always loved the forest. There was something about the stillness, the whispering leaves, and the soft, earthy smell that made it feel like an escape from the chaos of the world. But if I'd known what lay waiting for me at Ravenwood Lake, I would have never set foot in those woods again. It all started with a casual suggestion from my friend, Eric. He had a way of convincing people to do things they wouldn't normally consider. "Come on," he'd said, flashing me that boyish grin of his. "We'll make a weekend of it. Just you, me, and the great outdoors. Ravenwood Lake is supposed to be beautiful this time of year." I'd heard of Ravenwood Lake before. Everyone in the nearby town had. It was tucked deep in the forest, a good 5-mile hike from the nearest road. The stories about it were as old as the town itself. Stories of people disappearing, strange lights hovering over the water, and an eerie silence that seemed unnatural, even for the forest. But like most local legends, they were easy to dismiss as campfire tales meant to scare kids into staying out of trouble. Still, there was something about the way people spoke of Ravenwood that didn't sit right with me. It wasn't just fear, it was reverence, almost like they were talking about something sacred and forbidden. Eric didn't believe in any of it, of course. "Just old wives' tales," he scoffed as we packed our gear. "You'll see. It's just another lake. Peaceful, quiet, and maybe a little creepy if you let your imagination run wild." By the time we started the hike, the sun was already low in the sky. The dense canopy overhead made the forest feel darker than it should have been, and the shadows seemed to stretch and twist in ways that made me uneasy. Eric led the way, chatting about work and life, while I trailed behind, my eyes darting to every rustling bush and snapping twig. It wasn't until we were about halfway there that I noticed the silence. It crept up on us like a fog, muffling the usual forest sounds. The chirping birds, the rustle of leaves, even the hum of insects. It wasn't just quiet. It was oppressive, like the forest itself was holding its breath. "Do you hear that?" I asked, stopping in my tracks. Eric turned back, raising an eyebrow. "Hear what?" "Exactly." I gestured to the trees around us. "There's nothing. No birds, no crickets, nothing." He shrugged. "Maybe they're just not out right now. Relax. You're letting the stories get to you." But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The deeper we went, the more the forest seemed to close in around us. The trees grew taller and denser, their gnarled branches intertwining overhead like a cage. And then there was the path. It wasn't so much a trail as it was a suggestion of one, barely visible under the thick layer of fallen leaves. By the time we reached the lake, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the world was bathed in shades of gray. Ravenwood Lake stretched out before us, a vast glassy expanse of water that reflected the darkening sky. It was beautiful, in a haunting sort of way. The surface was so still it looked like a sheet of black glass, and the surrounding trees cast long skeletal shadows that reached out toward the water. Eric dropped his pack and let out a triumphant laugh. "See? Told you it was worth it." I didn't respond. My eyes were fixed on the lake, and a shiver ran down my spine as I realized something. There wasn't a single ripple on the water. No breeze, no movement, nothing. It was as if the lake was frozen in time. And then I saw it. At first, I thought it was just a trick of the light. A faint glow near the center of the lake, soft and pale, like moonlight filtering through the water. But as I watched, the glow grew brighter, pulsing like a heartbeat. Do you see that? I whispered, my voice barely audible. Eric turned to look, squinting at the water. See what? That light, I said, pointing toward the lake. Right there, in the middle. He frowned, shaking his head. I don't see anything. You sure you're not just tired? I wanted to believe him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the light was watching me. It wasn't just in the lake. It was in me, probing the deepest corners of my mind, stirring up memories I didn't even know I had. I took a step back, my breath quickening. Eric laughed, oblivious to my growing panic. Come on, man. Don't tell me you're scared already. We just got here. But I was scared. I was more scared than I'd ever been in my life. And deep down, I knew one thing for certain. Ravenwood Lake wasn't just a lake. It was something else. Something ancient and alive. And it had been waiting for us. Eric's carefree attitude did little to calm my nerves. The glow in the middle of the lake was impossible to ignore, no matter how much he dismissed it. It pulsed slowly, almost hypnotically, cast in faint ripples of light across the still surface of the water. I wanted to leave. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to turn around and head back to the safety of the trail. But Eric had already started setting up camp by the shore, completely unbothered. This is perfect, he said, pulling out his flashlight and unrolling his sleeping bag. We'll make a fire, cook some food, and tomorrow we'll explore a bit. You'll see, it's just a lake. Just a lake. I kept repeating those words in my mind, trying to convince myself. But it wasn't working. There was something about Ravenwood that felt fundamentally wrong. Like we were trespassing on sacred ground. Help me with the firewood, will you? Eric called, snapping me out of my thoughts. I nodded reluctantly and wandered into the nearby trees, flashlight in hand. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but it felt weak and feeble against the oppressive shadows of the forest. The silence followed me like a second shadow, wrapping around me tightly. Every snap of a twig beneath my feet sounded deafening, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. As I bent down to gather a few branches, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. I froze, my heart pounding. Slowly, I turned my head, sweeping the flashlight across the trees. Nothing, just empty woods. I let out a shaky breath and laughed nervously. Get a grip, I muttered to myself. But as I straightened up, I saw it again. A flicker of movement, just at the edge of the flashlight's beam. It was quick, like a shadow darting between the trees. Eric? I called out, my voice trembling. No answer. The silence was suffocating now, pressing against my ears like a heavy weight. I turned back toward the campsite, clutching the firewood tightly. My legs felt like lead as I trudged through the underbrush, every step accompanied by the growing certainty that something was following me. When I finally emerged from the trees, Eric was crouched by the fire pit, coaxing a small flame to life. He looked up and grinned. Took you long enough? I saw something, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Eric laughed, tossing another log onto the fire. You're jumpy tonight. It's probably just a deer or something. But it wasn't a deer. I knew what I'd seen, or at least I thought I did. The fire crackled to life, casting flickering shadows across the campsite. I sat down by the flames, clutching my knees to my chest and trying to ignore the growing unease that gnawed at my gut. That's when we heard it. A splash. Both of us froze, turning our heads toward the lake. The water, which had been eerily still just moments ago, now rippled gently, as if something, or someone, had disturbed it. Eric stood up, shining his flashlight toward the shore. "Probably a fish," he said, though his voice lacked its usual confidence. I wasn't so sure. The ripples grew larger, spreading outward from the center of the lake. And then we saw it. A figure, standing waist-deep in the water. At first, it was hard to make out any details. The figure was shrouded in darkness, barely illuminated by the faint glow of the lake. But as it began to move, stepping closer to the shore, the firelight caught its features. It wasn't human, not entirely. Its face was pale and featureless, like a blank mask, and its limbs were long and thin, almost skeletal. The water around it churned as it moved, but there was no sound, no splashing, no sloshing, nothing. Eric stumbled back, his flashlight shaking in his hands. "What the hell is that?" I couldn't answer. My throat felt tight, and my mind was racing. The figure stopped at the water's edge, its head tilting slightly, as if it were watching us. And then it spoke. Or at least, I think it did. The voice wasn't like anything I'd ever heard before. It was a low, guttural whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "Why, are you here?" The words sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. Eric, however, found his voice. "We didn't mean to disturb you," he stammered, taking a step back. "We were just camping. We'll leave, okay? We'll leave right now." The figure didn't respond. Instead, it raised one long, bony arm and pointed toward the woods behind us. For a moment, I thought it was telling us to go. But then I saw them. More figures, emerging from the trees. Dozens of them, their pale faces glowing faintly in the darkness. They moved silently, their blank eyes fixed on us. "Run," I whispered, grabbing Eric's arm. He didn't need to be told twice. We bolted into the forest, the firelight disappearing behind us as we plunged into the darkness. The figures didn't chase us, not at first, but as we ran, I could hear them, their footsteps impossibly light, like leaves brushing against the ground. And then came the whispers. They were faint at first, barely audible over the sound of our ragged breathing. But they grew louder and more insistent, a cacophony of voices that seemed to echo inside my head. I couldn't understand the words, but the tone was unmistakable, angry, accusing. "Keep running," Eric shouted, his voice tinged with panic. "Don't look back." But I couldn't help myself. I glanced over my shoulder and immediately wished I hadn't. The figures were closer now, their pale faces glowing like lanterns in the dark. Their movements were jerky and unnatural, as if they were puppets being controlled by invisible strings. Something cold and wet brushed against my arm, and I realized too late that we'd veered off the trail and into the swampy edges of the lake. My foot sank into the mud, and I stumbled, falling to my knees. Eric turned back, grabbing my arm and pulling me to my feet. "Come on," he shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the rising whispers. And then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, the figures stopped. They stood motionless at the edge of the swamp, their blank faces staring at us. The whispers faded into silence, and for a moment, all I could hear was the pounding of my heart. But the worst was yet to come. Eric and I didn't dare move. The figures stood frozen at the edge of the swamp, their featureless faces turned toward us. It was as if they were waiting. For what, I couldn't tell. The air was thick with an unnatural stillness, broken only by the faint rustling of leaves. "Don't make a sound," Eric whispered. his voice barely audible. My body trembled as I fought the urge to scream. The cold, wet mud clung to my legs, making it nearly impossible to move. The figures didn't step closer, but their presence was suffocating. Then, without warning, the one closest to the lake raised its arm again, pointing toward the water. Eric shook his head vehemently. "No way," he muttered. "We're not going anywhere near that." But I felt something, a pull, deep and primal, urging me to look back at the lake. Slowly, I turned my head, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The glow in the center of the lake had intensified, illuminating the water in an eerie, otherworldly light. Shapes were moving beneath the surface, long, shadowy forms, twisting and writhing like serpents. "It's calling us," I whispered, though I wasn't sure why I said it. The words felt foreign, like they didn't belong to me. Eric grabbed my arm, his grip tight and desperate. "We need to go. Now." But the moment he pulled me, the figures reacted. They stepped forward in unison, their movements slow but deliberate. The whispers returned louder this time, and filled with anger. I froze, torn between two equally terrifying choices: stay and face the figures, or head toward the lake and whatever lay beneath its surface. "We don't have a choice," I said, my voice shaking. "If we don't go, they'll—" I didn't finish the sentence. We both knew what they would do. Reluctantly, we turned toward the water. The mud sucked at our feet as we trudged forward, the glow growing brighter with each step. The figures followed us, keeping their distance but never letting us out of their sight. When we reached the water's edge, the glow became blinding. The lake no longer looked like water. It was a shimmering, shifting mass of light and shadow, pulsating like a heartbeat. Eric hesitated, but before he could say anything, the ground beneath us gave way. We were pulled under. The sensation was unlike anything I'd ever experienced. It wasn't like drowning. It was as if the lake had swallowed us whole, dragging us into a world that defied all logic. I couldn't see Eric, but I could feel him struggling beside me, his hand grasping at mine. The whispers were deafening now, surrounding us in an endless cacophony. They spoke in a language I couldn't understand, yet the meaning was clear. They were accusing us, judging us. I felt an overwhelming sense of guilt, though I couldn't pinpoint why. And then I saw them. The figures. They were here too, their glowing faces floating in the darkness around us. But they weren't alone. There were others, dozens, maybe hundreds, trapped beneath the lake. Their faces were twisted in expressions of terror and despair, their mouths open in silent screams. "Eric!" I shouted, my voice barely audible over the whispers. "We have to get out of here." But Eric wasn't listening. He was staring at something ahead of us, his eyes wide with horror. I turned to follow his gaze, and my heart nearly stopped. In the center of the lake, the shadows had taken form. A massive figure loomed above us, its body made of the same shifting light and shadow as the lake itself. Its eyes burned like twin suns, and its presence radiated an ancient, overwhelming power. "You have trespassed," it said, its voice echoing inside my mind. "This is sacred ground." "We didn't know," Eric shouted, his voice cracking. "We didn't mean to—" The figure raised a hand, and Eric was silenced. He clutched at his throat, his eyes wide with panic. I tried to reach for him, but an invisible force held me in place. "You are not the first," the figure said, its gaze shifting to me. "And you will not be the last." It extended its hand, and I felt a searing pain in my chest, like my very soul was being torn apart. Memories flashed before my eyes, moments I'd long forgotten, things I'd done, regrets I'd buried deep. The figure was sifting through my mind, judging me for my sins. Please, I whispered, tears streaming down my face. We didn't mean to disturb you. Let us go. For a moment, the figure said nothing. Then it spoke again, its voice cold and final. You have been marked. With a blinding flash of light, we were thrown out of the lake and onto the shore. The figures were gone, and the glow had vanished, leaving the lake dark and still once more. I gasped for air, clutching at my chest. Eric lay beside me, coughing violently. We're alive, he said, his voice weak. I can't believe we're alive. But as we stood up and looked around, we realized something was wrong. The forest was different. The trees were taller, their branches twisting in unnatural shapes. The air was heavy, filled with an oppressive silence. And then we saw it, the mark. It was etched into the ground where we had landed, a glowing symbol that pulsed faintly before fading into the earth. I glanced at Eric, and he at me. Neither of us said a word, but we both knew the truth. We hadn't escaped, not really. Whatever lived in that lake had let us go, but it had left its mark on us. We were part of its world now, forever tied to the darkness of Ravenwood. And deep down, I knew it was only a matter of time before it came back to claim us.